Hello everyone, I'm Riccardo Degni from Made for Code Academy, and in this video we are going to learn how to use the final keyword in the Java programming language. The final keyword is kind of a tricky topic in the Java language and may lead to unexpected errors if not understood properly. The final keyword is a non-access modifier that can be used in combination either with properties, either static and non-static, methods and classes. So we are going to look at how to use the final keyword in each of these scenarios. So let's start by defining how we can use the final keyword in combination with properties. We can say that a final property or a final field is a property or a variable that whose value cannot be edited nor updated. So we can say that if we mark a property as a final property, we are creating a constant value. So let's try it out. For example, let's create a class called person that represents a person in our virtual reality. And first of all, let's declare a non-final property. So for example, int id. As an instance property, this id property will be given a default value. In the case of int, it will be given the default value 0. So for example, if we create an instance of the class person called p1 equals new person, and then we print out the value of p1.id, let's run the program. As we can see, we get the value of 0 because the value 0 will be given to this property by default. This is a non-final, non-static property, but if we mark this property as a final property, as we can see, we get this error, variable id might not have been initialized. Why we get this? Because this variable is not assigned a value, so a constant cannot be an empty variable. So we can set a value for this property in three different ways. Of course, we can set a value for the property ID directly in the declaration of the property. So for example, we can write final int ID equals 10. And here, if we run our program, we get 10. But of course, as a constant, we cannot change its value. So for example, if we write p1.id equals 20 or another value, we get this error. And the compiler will complain by saying that we cannot assign a value to the final variable id. So our final variables indicate constants. This is very important, a very important topic in the Java programming language. We have not the keyword const or constant, but the final keyword, when applied to properties, indicates a constant value. So let's remove this line. Okay, the second way we can assign a value to a final variable is in the constructor. So for example, here we can write this id equals, for example, 10 or 5. So as we can see, we get no error at all because we are sure that we are going to assign a value to our ID property, because the constructor will be called when we create an instance of the class person. So we can be sure that the variable ID will be assigned a value. So if we run our program, we get the new value, and the value is 5, of course. So here there is an important point to remember, and it is that if we have multiple constructors, so for example we can of course declare more than one constructor by overloading the first constructor, and for example with an integer parameter we can here we get this error: variable ID might not have been initialized, the old error that we got previously. And why do we get this error now? Because the compiler cannot know if we will create an instance of this class by using this constructor or this constructor. So to prevent the compiler throwing an error, we have to set the value for the variable ID in every constructor that we declared in our class. So for example, here we can set the value of this ID to the int value 6, and now we get no error at all, because we set the value of the final property in every constructor. So this is a very important and a key point to understand and to remember when we are dealing with the final properties. So let's comment this, and let's see the third way to assign a value to a final property, and this is done by the initializer block. This is an initializer block, and this block, this code block will be called before the constructor. So if we set the value of the final variable in there, we could be sure that the final variable will be assigned a value. So as we can see, the compiler won't complain. So let's run our program to test it. As we can see, we get the value of 7 because we set the value in the initializer block. Always remember that if you use an initializer block to initialize a value for a final variable, you won't be able to set a new value for this variable in the constructor. So this is an error. Variable ID might already have been assigned to. So here we assign a value to the variable ID, and here we update the value. So always remember that the initializer block will be called before any constructor. So this is an error, and this is why we will comment this line of code. So this is the final keyword when applied to a non-static variable. We have three different mode to set a value for a final non-static variable, but in our classes, of course, we can create static final variables. So for example, if we have a static final int another ID, this is an error because we didn't set a value for this static final variable, and of course the compiler will complain by saying that the variable another ID might not have been initialized. So here we have two different ways to set a value. Always remember that a static final variable could be written as a final static variable. This is perfectly fine and legal. So always remember that you can write final static or static final. This is the same. And so the first mode to assign a value to a final static variable is of course to assign a value in the directly in the declaration process. So for example, here we can set the value of 4, and as we can see, the compiler won't throw any error. But if we skip the assignment, of course we can use the second mode, and this is done by using the static initializer block that will belong to the class, in contrast to the non-static initializer block that will belong to the single instance, specific instance. So in there we can set the value for another ID. Another ID equals 4. In there we have assigned a value for another ID, and as we can see, there are no errors anymore. So these are the two ways we can set a value for a final static property, either by assign a value in the declaration process or in the static initializer block. No, you couldn't set a value in the constructor for the static final property, because if we set this value, of course, let's comment this line of code, we get the error, variable another ID might not have been initialized. Why does it happen? Because the constructor will be called, of course, when an instance will be created. So if we create 10 instances of the class person, this line of code will be called. This ID equals this another ID equals 4, and so the value of the variable another ID will be updated at each creation of a new instance. And this is not fine, because the final static another ID variable is a constant value, and we can't set a new value for this property. The difference between the non-static property and the static property is this, that the non-static property belongs to the specific instance, so we can set its value directly in the constructor, and this assignment will be done once. If we make the same operation with a static property, this is wrong, because this property belongs to the class. So this is a property that is shared by each instance of the class person, and so if we are going to set the value of this another ID, of course we are updating the value of this variable that is shared by each instance, and so this is really wrong. So let's comment this line of code, remove the comment in there, and so this is fine, and the compiler will not complain. As a good rule, we can declare the final properties as uppercased variable. So for example, we can write ID with uppercase letter, and another ID with uppercase letters. So let's update this and this value. So if we see some uppercase property value, we can almost always be sure that the value will refer to a final property, either static or non-static. So the static keyword can be, as we said before, used in combination with methods and classes too. So let's see the final keyword applied to a method. So for example, here we can create a method, for example, void say hello, that of course does a dummy operation, for example, prints a hello string. This is fine. We can mark this method as a final method, and if we mark a method as a final method, this method cannot be overridden. So we can be sure that the implementation or the method body of this method won't be changed through the hierarchy of our classes. So for example, if here we create class programmer extends person, and we try to override this method, we get some kind of error, and the compiler will complain by saying that the method say hello cannot be overridden because the overridden method in the class person is final. So this is very useful if you want to prevent some method to be overridden. Of course, we can be more explicit here by declaring an override annotation, but this is an error, of course. So let's comment this. And finally, we can set the final keyword in combination with the class too. So if here we set public final class person, we get an error. This error is cannot inherit from final person. Why do we get this kind of error? Because when we mark a class as a final class, this class cannot be extended anymore. So if you want your class not to be extended by some other classes, you have to mark this class as a final class. This is very, very important, a very important point to remember. There is another important point to understand when we are dealing with the final keyword in combination with property, and this is that we can't update the external value of a variable, but we can change the internal state of a reference value or a reference property. So for example, if here we import an array list, for example, here we can set a final array list of, for example, strings property called words. Let's declare an instance. So here we get no errors at all because we have set a value for this variable, and we cannot update this external value, but we can update the internal state of this variable. So for example, in the constructor we can add some internal value to our words array list. So for example, we can write the add method that will add some value to our array list instance. So for example, 1, 2, and 3. Let's try this out. So for example, we can print directly the value of p1.words because the array list defines a toString method, of course. Let's run it. So of course here we get this error because we have updated the variable name. So let's set ID with uppercase letters. Let's rerun our program. Okay, as we can see, we get the value of the array list 1, 2, 3, and let's add another value to our array list, p1.words.add 4, and print out again the new internal state of this array list. So as we can see, although this array list property is marked as final, we were able to update its internal state, and this is perfectly fine and perfectly legal. But of course we cannot reassign a new value. So for example, if we write p1.words equals new array list avoid array list, we get some kind of error. Of course, let's import the array list first of all, and as we can see, we get this kind of error, cannot assign a value to the final variable words. So at the end of the day, we can say that we cannot update the external value of a final variable in the case of an instance property, but we can update the internal state of our final properties, and this is perfectly fine in the Java programming language. So that's all for today's lesson. I hope you have enjoyed it, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.